Welcome to Miyconst Hardware. My YouTube journey started with the Intel LGA 2011 version 3 platform that supports CPUs such as Xeon E5v3 and E5v4. Even though the platform is still relevant for budget and ultra-budget configurations, it is already fully covered on my channel and it's not much more I can explore. On my channel you can find multiple different benchmarks, you can also find many different motherboard reviews of Chinese and not very Chinese X99 motherboards. And a part of my videos on YouTube you can find many different LGA 2011 version 3 related content, so it's really time to move on. The Intel LGA 2066 platform that's supposed to be a successor to LGA 2011 version 3 is a big disappointment. The CPUs for this platform use different internal architecture, the L3 cache capacity reduced significantly, so we have very pathetic performance, especially in gaming. The power consumption is also not the best. It still could be an interesting subject to explore, but the prices are absolutely ridiculous. And additionally to this, Intel decided to split consumer X299 chipset from the server counterpart. So the Xeon CPUs do not work on the consumer X299 chipset, and the i7 i9 CPUs do not work on the server LGA 2066 motherboards. So I could have done something like others did and move on to review the modern hardware, modern CPUs, modern motherboards, but honestly speaking, I don't have motivation for that. YouTube is already oversaturated with high-quality benchmarks and reviews of the modern CPUs, motherboards, video cards, and so on. So I wanted to find something unique. And the next platform would be Intel LGA 3647. Even though the CPUs for this platform are starting to go down in price, it is still next to impossible to find a compatible motherboard. That's why when BIOS engineer found the Supermicro X11SPi-TF motherboard on German eBay for about 300 euros plus shipping, I decided to go for it. I thought it will be a little investment into my channel, but soon I realized that it's gonna be a very big investment. A part of the Supermicro motherboard, I also bought a dual socket option from Intel, Intel S2600ST that can accept two LGA 3647 Xeons. About the Intel motherboard I will tell in my future videos, but for now I'm going to use a Supermicro X11 with an Intel Xeon Gold 6268CL CPU. Xeon 6268CL is an unofficial so-called off-road map CPU, and that means that you will not be able to find specification of the CPU on the official Intel website. And that's why I thought it might be or should be double interesting to test it and see what it is capable of. So, Intel Xeon Gold 6268CL, what is this kind of a beast and how to cook it? The CPU has 24 cores, 48 threads, Cascade-like architecture, it was released somewhere in 2020, and Intel used its famous or infamous 14nm tech process. The CPU has 205 watts TDP and 2.8 GHz base frequency. Turbo frequency goes all the way up to 3.9 GHz, but only with the 2 CPU cores. With 4 CPU cores, turbo goes to 3.7 GHz, 8 to 20 cores used we have 3.6 GHz, and with all 24 cores we have 3.4 GHz. Unlike most of the Cascade-like CPUs such as a Xeon 6200, 8200 that support DDR4 2933, 6268CL supports only DDR4 2666, which is a big disappointment. The CPU is also equipped with only 33 MB of L3 cache. In comparison, E5-2697v3 that has only 14 cores comes with 35 MB cache. So in the past we had 35 MB of L3 cache for 14 cores, and now we have 33 MB of L3 cache for 24 cores. Still, we have got more PCI Express lanes, this time it's 48 of them, and all of them are PCI Express 3.0. V3, V4 CPUs have only 40 PCI Express lanes, so it's 8 extra. Xeon Gold 6268CL is an off-road CPU, so the motherboard support might be questionable. For example, with my Intel S2600 ST, it started up with no problem and without BIOS updates. With my Supermicro X11SPi-TF, the CPU would not boot even if I install the latest Supermicro BIOS. Here I needed some help from BIOS engineer who made me a custom BIOS for Supermicro motherboard that works just fine with the 6268CL and other CL CPUs. If you're interested in this BIOS and you would like to purchase it, then feel free to contact him through Patreon. The basic CPU specs are covered. Now let's take a look at the test bench configuration and how much I had to pay for it. For the CPU I paid about 350 euros, for the motherboard Supermicro X11SPi-TF I paid about 300 euros, and we need the 6 identical memory sticks, so I went with the 6 32 gigs Samsung DDR4 2933 ECC registered modules. For these I paid about 150 euros, and for cooler I paid, well, 250 euros, and that's because I went with the 360mm AIO Alpha Cool Ace-Bear Pro Aurora 360. For the power supply I paid about 150 euros, and it is Corsair RM850E. So the total price of this test bench excluding the SSDs and the graphics card is about 1200 euros. Yeah, goodbye my motorcycle dreams. Because the Xeon Gold 6268CL has too many cores, and by disabling a few cores we can achieve higher boost clock, I decided to test 3 different configurations. The first one is the default 24 cores 48 threads. The second one is 20 cores 48 threads, where we can keep 3.6 GHz max boost frequency, and the last one 20 cores 20 threads, means hyperthreading is disabled. According to Aida64 memory test, the RAM performance is basically identical with all 3 configurations. As expected, the 6 memory channels are providing very good numbers, but the memory latency is pretty bad, around 86 nanoseconds. Custom memory timings I left for the future because the motherboard takes ages to boot and it also takes a lot of time to verify stability. So for this video I am testing the standard DDR4 2666 CL19 memory configuration. Before I go into the test results, let's take a look how the CPU behaves and what frequency it holds under different workloads. Starting with the Cinebench R23 10 minutes throttle test. Here, with all 24 cores enabled, we have constant 3.4 GHz frequency. If I disable 4 cores and keep 20 cores 40 threads, the CPU goes up to 3.6 GHz and stays there on all 20 cores. The same behavior applies to 20 cores 20 threads, means hyperthreading is disabled. Cinebench 2024 is a much newer test that uses modern instructions, and here Xeon Gold 6268CL is not able to upkeep its maximum turbo frequency. With the 24 cores, the frequency stays between 2.9 and 3.4 GHz. With the 20 cores enabled, the frequency is somewhere between 3.1 and 3.6 GHz, and the behavior is the same with or without hyperthreading. In games, the situation is a bit different. For example, in Assassin's Creed Mirage with the 24 or 20 cores with or without hyperthreading, the CPU cores that are doing the job are boosting up to 3.6 GHz. The other cores which are idling can go as low as 2.8 GHz. It is also worth mentioning that MSI Afterburner is only able to monitor up to 32 threads. So with the 24 core and 20 core configuration, we have a couple of CPU cores that are not displayed in the stats. In Counter-Strike we see a slightly different picture. Here with the 24 cores enabled, the CPU is mostly boosting up to 3.4, not 3.6 GHz. But disabling 4 cores and going with the 20 core configuration brings back the 3.6 GHz turbo frequency with or without hyperthreading. Now it's time for some testing. Starting with the Cinebench R23, we can see that 6268CL improves single-core performance compared to Xeon V3 V4. It scores about 1015 points, which is good but not good enough. Ryzen 5 5600 scores 1470 points, and Ryzen 7 7700 is almost double as fast. It scores 1820 points. With all CPU cores utilized, their results are not that impressive either. 24-core 48-thread configuration scores about 25,850 points. 20 cores 40 threads, 23,200 points, and 20 cores 20 threads, 18,300 points, and this value is roughly equal to Ryzen 7 7700 that has only 8 physical cores and 16 threads. It scores about 18,413 points. In Cinebench 2024, we have very similar picture with the 24 cores, 48 threads, 6268CL scores about 1441 points. 20 cores, 40 threads, 1286 points, and 20 cores, 20 threads, 1070 points, which is very comparable to Ryzen 7 7700 that scores 1050 points. Again, we can see that 20 physical cores of 6268CL are roughly the same as Ryzen 7 7700 with 8 physical cores and 16 threads, when all CPU cores are utilized, of course. Geekbench 6 is not a single benchmark, it's more like a set of benchmarks, and these benchmarks are often relying on the single core performance. Thus, the multiple configurations of 6268CL produce almost identical results. 24-core 48 threads and 20-core 40 thread score about identical, about 13,000 points, and only if you disable hyperthreading with the 20 cores you get about 12,420 points. At the same time, Ryzen 7 7700 that has only 8 physical cores and 16 threads scores 14,850 points. So yeah, in such workloads where single-core performance matters, Ryzen 7 7700 or any other modern Ryzen will be significantly better. And the last synthetic benchmark is Blender Open Data. Here, every core, every thread matters. 24-core 48 threads scores 370 points, 20-core 40 threads 328 points, 20-core 20 threads 265 points, which is again roughly equals to Ryzen 7 7700 that scores 280 points. In order to roughly understand gaming performance of a Xeon 6268CL, it's enough to take a look at the 3DMark CPU profile benchmark. Here we have multiple scores, but let's start with the 1-core and 2-core values. All configurations of 6268CL score about 630 points with 1 core and about 1220 points with the 2 cores, while Ryzen 5 5600 has 880 and 1740 points. Ryzen 7 7700 is almost double as fast. It has 1072 points and 2100 points. The 4-core and 8-core scores are the most important for gaming and general productivity. Here, Xeon 6268CL fails to impress yet again. The results are almost identical between all 3 tested configurations, and the values are about 2400 with 4 cores and about 4500 with 8 cores. At the same time, Ryzen 5 5600 that has only 6 physical cores scores 3345 and 4775 points. Ryzen 7 7700 is yet again almost double as fast, 4200 and 7370 points. The final results when 16 cores or all cores are utilized are only important for those who are using PC for rendering, video production, 3D modeling, and so on. Here, naturally, the more cores you have, the better result you will get. Still, it is worth mentioning that when 16 cores are utilized, 6268CL is only able to roughly match Ryzen 7 7700 that has only 8 physical cores and 16 threads. Apart of 3DMark CPU profile, I also tested 3DMark Steel Nomad, but here I don't have Xeon V3 V4 results, so I just picked something from the online database. This doesn't seem to be a very CPU-intensive benchmark because all three CPU configurations of 6268CL produce the same result of about 5400 points, and this result is just slightly worse than Ryzen 5 5600 and Ryzen 7 7700 that score about 5600 points. Now it's time for some real gaming benchmarks, and here as usual I use my AMD RX 7900 XT, 1080p screen resolution, resizable bar enabled, and whenever possible AMD FSR, NVIDIA DLSS and other upscalers were disabled. So let's start with Assassin's Creed Mirage. This game doesn't really see a difference between a 24 or 20 core configuration of 6268CL. The scores are about the same, about 110 FPS minimum, 195 FPS on average, which is very close to Ryzen 5 5600, which scores 127-194 FPS, and slightly better than Xeon's V3 V4. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora doesn't see a difference between 24, 20 cores hyperthreading enabled or disabled with 6268CLs. The scores are identical, 94, 119 FPS. This time is just a tiny bit better than Ryzen 5 5600 and V3 V4 Xeons. F1 2021 believes that the 20-core 20-thread configuration of 6268CL is the best. It scores 224, 322 FPS. Enabling hyperthreading reduces the results to 215, 308 FPS, and enabling all 24 cores reduces it even further, 208, 310 FPS. Still, none of these configurations were able to match Ryzen 5 5600 that scores 255, 358 FPS. Counter-Strike 2 is an online shooter without built-in gaming benchmarks, so the results are not very consistent. Even though I played 3 matches 10 minutes each, we still have not very reliable data. Nevertheless, 6268CL seems to produce basically identical results no matter how many cores or hyperthreading enabled disabled. We get about 100 FPS 1% lows and 210-230 FPS on average. This is better than Xeon V3 V4, but not enough to beat Ryzen 5 5600 that delivers about 116-162 FPS. I have also tested Rainbow Six Extraction, but unfortunately here I don't have fresh results for Xeon V3 V4 and Ryzen 5 CPUs, so let's just take a look at this weird example where 20-core 20-thread configuration of 6268CL takes the lead. In this case we have 295-337 FPS. Enabling hyperthreading reduces the score to 253-278 FPS, and enabling all 24 cores reduces the score even further to 242-268 FPS. Finally, I have also played XDefiant a little bit. This game does not have a built-in benchmark as well, so I have to play the game, and the results are also not very consistent. Still, we can see that XDefiant believe that 20-core 20-thread configuration is the best. On average, we have about 250 FPS. With the 20 cores, 40 threads, the averages drop to 230 FPS, and with 24 cores, 48 threads, the averages are just 208 FPS. Of course, the results would be incomplete if I would not cover power consumption. Here it's important to mention that I report entire system power consumption, not just the CPU power consumption, and I test Assassin's Creed Mirage for gaming and Cinebench R23 for workload benchmarks. As you can see from these charts, Xeon 6268CL is not a very power-efficient CPU. With all 24 cores enabled, on the Cinebench R23 test, the system consumes about 350 watts. With the 20 cores, 40 threads, the system consumes about 330 watts, and the 20 cores, 20 threads consumes about 277 watts. What's interesting is that the Xeon EFI 2697AV4 seems to be the most efficient. With the 16 cores, it consumes about 160 watts. Let me convert this data into points or FPS per watt so we can see the efficiency of the CPUs. So with the 6268CL, when we have 24 cores, 48 threads, we have 74 Cinebench points for 1 watt of electricity. Disabling 4 cores and forcing the CPU to boost up to 3.6 GHz reduces the efficiency, and we get only 70 Cinebench points per watt. Disabling hyperthreading further reduces efficiency, and we get only 66 points for 1 watt. And yes, EFI2697AV4 seems to be the most efficient out of the Xeons. It delivers 87 points for 1 watt of electricity. EFI2697V3 with a turbo boost unlock is the least efficient. It delivers only 54 points for 1 watt of electricity. Ryzen 5 5600 is out of any competition here. It delivers 101 points for 1 watt of electricity. During gaming, the main power consumption goes to the graphics card, so all Xeons provide about the same efficiency. For 1 watt of electricity consumed, we have about 0.4 FPS rendered on the screen. Still, Ryzen 5 5600 is much more efficient here, and we get about 0.52 FPS rendered on the screen for 1 watt of consumed electricity. So these are the results, and if you ask my opinion, then I would say that at the moment LGA3647 does not make much sense. The availability and the pricing is not the best, the performance is a bit underwhelming, the power consumption is a bit too high. If you're looking to build a regular gaming computer or you need a workstation without any specific server features, then AMD AM5 or even AMD AM4 would be a much better fit. Intel LGA 1700 at the moment I cannot recommend because of the Core i9 crashes and because LGA 1700 is basically dead. In the near future, Intel is going to release a new platform, and that one might be more interesting. Still, Intel LGA 3647 is a good option if you are looking to build a budget, enterprise-grade workstation or a server. With this platform, you get 6 memory channels and you can use high-capacity ECC-registered modules. You also get 48 PCI Express lanes, enterprise-quality Supermicro and Intel motherboards, all the Intel virtualization and security features, and additionally, Xeon CPUs do support AVX512 instructions if you need them. Intel consumer-grade CPUs such as i7, i9 do not support AVX512, but we don't yet know what's gonna happen with the next gen. So, in short, if you need LGA 3647 features, then yes, it's a good option. If you do not need these features, then don't waste your time, don't waste your money, just go and buy AM4 or AM5. With this, I have to say thanks for watching, thanks for listening, I hope it was interesting and enjoyable. Bye for now, and see you in the next videos.